Oh, hello there. I believe I've just taken the elevator up to the right floor above the bottom line of education. What is that bottom line of education, I might ask? Let's find out. From a certain research perspective. Before we get into that, I want to invite everyone to take a breath before we dive into some of the nitty-gritty systemic underlyings of what helps and hinders school functioning. I invite you to close your eyes, find your spine in a line, finding that space where you are truly relaxed and easefully attentive. And it can help to recenter and return your attention to the present moment, the breath and the body, perhaps with some intentionally emphasized inhalations and exhalations, breathing deeply through your nostrils and exhaling out. Allow the natural rhythm of your breath in your own time, in your body's line, and the way that your um, natural system of yourself wants to breathe. Go ahead and just follow that flow of your own breath, like watching the waves of the ocean coming and going, and no need to change anything except to just accept them as they are, observe and be present with the waves of the breath coming and going. You're ready, returning to this moment with your eyes open, and we'll come into a review of week 4. And I referenced the bottom line as an option of a video that some might have watched. Uh, and let me share my screen here. Okay. And other people might have watched the other option. Uh, there were two movie options to watch. So the bottom line was one option, and Education Incorporated was that other video option. So whichever you found, I hope that you found some meaning in, and then we can review the other one here as well. In this underlying um, economical theory of market approach to education. And those dots and figures kind of symbolic of the um, stock and money capital in the market idea. And so this overarching idea that we all are familiar with and embedded in to varying degrees, but certainly participate in um, as consumers, is that competition between suppliers is helpful in bringing the quality of products up and the price um, of having high quality down. Um, and that is driven by us as the consumers and our choices. That, as a law of economics, ideally, um, this market approach theory, uh, it it suggests that consumers will gravitate to the best options, and hence this capital ideology underlying that. with when choosing, consumers and in the market will choose the best options for themselves and then support expanding markets that are of quality, and that contributing to the overall quality of the market, capital improvement. And that being an idea applied to schools, and that sort of business framework. Um, so there is a certain embodiment in education that is completely reliant on um, an economic infrastructure and funds. Um, at the same time, there's also products of education that are not tangible products like a degree. And it might be areas of critical thinking, ways of thinking, ways of viewing and living that support uh, that are different in terms of different and not being a metric, an economic asset that can be theorized. So that's why there's tension between an economic theory application to education, such as this market approach, and some of the quality of interactions, experiences that gets lost in the approach. Um, we do exist in from Berliner's perspective, um, uh, a culture that there is a myth that money doesn't matter, and that, as we talk about in the bottom line later on, can be politically emphasized and advertised, such as in the Reagan administration's um, national risk report, showing that even with all this money being put into schools, there's not improvements being made. And like relative to our international counterparts in other countries, there's a stark difference in our quality of improvement. Um, and looking at how we're measuring that with this National Assessment of Education Progress, or the nation's report card, um, that is using standardized testing to um, to measure the quality, right? And again, we're taking education and making it a product, and that like GDP, or that the value of that product is how high the test score um, is, and teachers and schools and systems being very dependent on having high quality, right? Like Gucci, or a like a certain brand, um, like MacBooks has a different like expectation for the consumer and their quality, and similar with schools. And we know that through our experience. And we might have some Iolani or Punahou grads that have like a lot of merit in the name that comes with that. And that can be, not saying that that is undeserved, because these are very high quality institutions of education. Um, but I am saying that there is possibility for high quality education in public schools as well. And I think that's the underlying argument with Berliner's demythologizing some of this. So um, that all being dependent though on how much resources being put into the school, and pure pupil spending being really important to consider, where public schools are able to allot, so oftentimes a capped number of per pupil spending, versus a private institution that is well established with an endowment such as a Punahou's, so something over $200 million endowment, from the private sector, and past students being able to um, support a higher amount of pupil spending. Um, just to circle back to the NAEP's measurement, and that metric of high quality education, it is important to name that, like a white male privileged um, standard of testing, um, those tests are often constructed in this framework so that that middle and high class students and again these are often white male centric um, system supporting uh, entities and organizations funded and actualized through individuals. Um, Tests are often based on a different culture than a lot of other diverse and marginalized minority students are familiar with. Um, so the fact that the Reagan administration was claiming that schools were not performing as highly um, doesn't account for that the way that we're looking at how schools are performing that is based on um, a point of view that is uh, from a homogenous, um, perhaps patriarchal perspective that doesn't account for more of the American melting pot, different cultures and different backgrounds, socioeconomic situations that uh, don't allow the same kind of framework for thinking uh, about performance on a high stakes test. Um, so let's go ahead and move on to just recapping Berliner's 36 myth that there is equal money being spent um, within school districts. Uh, and I think it is also helpful to look at that slide. Really, yeah, probably have to zoom in a little bit, but seeing that only uh, a small portion, and this is a slide from 2017-18 that 7.8% of funding was for school districts was coming from the federal government. But you can see, and it's not verbatim um, exactly what is the 2025 percentage, but you can get the general sense that states and local property taxes, um, the funding at a state level is what is most significant in supporting school districts. That said, a different neighborhood within a school districts, um, they will have access to possibly very different resources. Some of the evidence that Berliner was talking about was the affluence and demographics of neighborhoods and choosing to support um, certain values. So actually investing in schools when there's really a high amount of the population that has kids, but in other populations that don't have kids, why would they put their tax dollars to supporting schools? And as well as like it's seeming like there's equal compensation to different schools within the same district. However, having that variant teacher quality and experience, class ratio, amount of supplies and technology that um, are both offered and the quality of the supplies offered. So there's a lot of loopholes in different ways that um, a school and a school district can shift and support funding in certain areas more than others. And those areas are often with more capital so that they can hold more capital in upper middle class areas in this view of capitalism, social competition, which rubs against the grain of schools being for the equity of all students. And no matter what this public school or the situation of the student, that American ideal of having an equal opportunity to um, partake in schooling and to promote one's best potential. Um, that being challenged here with looking at the ways that um, school systems can uh, be um, shifted to support uh, those that will support them more, such as with with having not low poverty but high money based student populations. Um, the Civil Beat article by Wong, I think was helpful and surprising maybe for some to think about the teachers in public education in Hawaii get paid more than in private uh, institutions on average. Now, as we said, there are certainly exceptions, like Punahou and Iolani and other renowned private schools that have their own sources of endowment, so they can pay their teachers more. But because of the state and slight bit, but mostly state support for public schools, there is more resources in their pot that they can pull from. Um, and often that Title One is a key word to think about for the ways that the federal government is supporting um, the uh, the schools. And I wanted to quickly jump over to, let's see if we can go to the New York Times article, which we did not read for this class. However, I did think it was pretty timely with this new administration. And this article is from just a few days ago, last week actually, January 30th. And it talks about Trump's uh, pol political view on education and the two executive orders that he put into place. The first one being pretty ideological on focusing on race, gender, and American history to prevent potential threats to um, more of an ideal American image. So making sure that we're not talking about structural racism, for example. And then the second one on the vouchers for private schools. So when we consider that movement, right, this is an interesting time to consider how will local level, state level schools respond or be able to respond, and what are the power dynamics between the federal and state level that are going to enact a lot of different outcomes for their students. So just key to read here, the major funding stream that supports public schools, known as Title One, goes out to states in a formula set by Congress, and the president has little to do with restricting that power. And again, if we think back to that pie chart, it is a small sliver, but it is a significant sliver that the federal government offers to school districts, whereas most of that has come from states' own funding and tax sources. It seems like a significant part of the strategy is to set priorities through executive orders and make the Congress or Supreme Court respond as they're supposed to in a system of checks and balances. The executive branch does not, the executive branch does control smaller tranches of discretionary funding, but they might not be able to persuade school districts to change their practices. And then it concludes actually with someone that we might get a little bit more familiar with, Adam Latz. And he says, to my mind, the executive order is a blast of steam, dangerous, especially because it can encourage local aggressive activism. But as he noted, political attempts to ban ideas from the classroom have rarely been successful. So this ties back into that notion of the balance and the nuances of how funds are being distributed, as well as how teachers and students are actually considering ideas that are going through the classroom. So let's switch back to the PowerPoint. And if you watch the Education Inc. documentary, you saw in the Colorado school systems, a lot of that, and across Colorado and New Jersey and other places, a lot of tensions that are happening when there are more private sector representatives voted into school board positions, and the voter turnout maybe not is not great for the local population, and locals realizing that that some of the uh, that situation is a little questionable when like a voucher uh, is in place in Colorado schools, so that so a voucher system is like you have kids in public school, and if you get funds put into public schools, and a voucher allows some of those students to have the opportunity to apply to different schools and to have perhaps a magnet or a charter or a specialized school of a different sort. Um, and sometimes those other, in the case that was presented in Education Inc., sometimes those other schools um, are actually just filler schools, so that uh, the way that vouchers can work is that they can funnel more funding into specific schools that are privately funded. And so there's a kind of a backdoor deal agreement between some of these more private voucher receiving schools, the lobbyists, and so that they can put more resources into um, schools. And that becomes um, tricky when you have public funds, public tax dollars that are supposed to be allocated equitably um, to all schools, but there being a siphoning off from one area and being more resources being put into another. And the suggestion from Education Inc. Was that the American Legislative Exchange Committee um, was was helpful in creating agreements so that these new the public schools options could pivot with the vouchers, and you could have emerging um, uh, like kind of a private business model of a school that is also able to receive public funding, but dump more into their school with private funding, and thus be a lot more equipped to be higher quality. And Bill Gates, this picture of him to the bottom right is a very significant proponent of charter school systems, and an anti-public school voice. Um, and that taps into that market approach of creating different options of schools so that there is more competition, and schools are competing for the best students and the resources. Um, so in the bottom line in education video, narrated by Meryl Streep, who was really cool to hear, famous actress and old actress. I know some of these films are a little bit on the older side, even though they've got some good quality. Um, but the proposal there was that the Reagan administration in the 80s, Ronald Reagan had a hand in releasing this report on the Nation at Risk, which documented that lack of quality. Even though there's tons of money being spent, schools are lacking quality. And why is that? And that being, there being a scapegoating of public schools. And I apologize, scapegoating schools, it should say scapegoating public schools there. And that was an economic market-based rhetoric that was helpful in promoting more of these choice schools. Those choice schools, voucher and charter schools, that could receive more funds and siphon some of those funds from public schools. And they mentioned also um, that that the claim, the market-based, that argument is saying like we're not improving on our standardized testing scores. This is kind of a the NAEP and Reagan's A Nation at Risk is a precursor to No Child Left Behind, which really pushed. And we still see that, even though there is some fading of the high stakes testing, um, but we still see that today. Um, and that difference uh, of approaches in education, and that being across different types of education, where some are advocating for a more student-centered approach and project-based learning, um, and less about the teaching to the test and high stakes testing performance as being paramount, important. And then the teacher-centered approach, which we saw with Ed Hirsch and the core the core standards, and student excellence through um, academic achievement on those high stakes testings. So on the right hand, you'll see that teacher-centered and like knowledge delivery, the idea of like if you have a really great teacher, they can just funnel knowledge into the student's brain as long as the student is willing to learn. Um, they have access to this high quality teacher. Um, versus on the left, on that student-centered perspective there, let me see if I can laser point it. On this left side, the student-centered approach not considers from like a top-down approach of funneling knowledge, but a bottom-up approach of considering where the student is at, socio-economically, culturally, and supporting the student to be active and having agency in creating their educational experience. Um, and I think the big last piece here to consider is that the Reagan administration and some of this marketplace rhetoric emphasizes that we're not performing well in American education uh, is not meeting a high enough mark, um, because we're not teaching rigorously enough. Schools are lacking quality. We shouldn't be dumping more school money into schools. We should be creating more schools. And um, that evidence, as Berliner was talking about, with the Myth 35 and the Hanushek's report and his meta-analysis, if you take if you consider some more of the peer-reviewed studies that include a larger demographic of students, and you consider the American education, um, that so much funds are being put into American education, but a lot of those funds are being targeted at marginalized students, students with disabilities, students coming from disenfranchised backgrounds, such as immigrants, and supporting their English language learning and then academic competence. There's a lot of resources being supported for students that are performing lower than high achievement, excellent testing students. And this is reflective of this huge melting pot, this very non-homo generous, this heterogeneous mixture of many people and from different backgrounds and cultures, and an education system that is seeking to support all students with equity. Um, but in that pursuit, maybe not testing across the board with an average of higher excellence, because there's emphasis on supporting students that are not able to test as well. Um, so it's hard to consider when we think about the bottom line in education of like what is really essential in in supporting success in schools and what is deemed success, defined as success, and the NAEP and um, certain ways of measuring tests and success is different from um, other ways, student versus teacher-centered ways of approaching that question of how do we raise um, the bare minimum and the bottom line of education. Um, and that relationship with money and funding being really important, especially in this matrix with money marketplace. So we'll end it there for this week. For next week, in lieu of this week's readings that brings into question a student's success measured through tests and through grades, and that uh, student versus teacher learning question. Next week's reflections and discussions to be posted on Padlet are actually going to be graded by you. You're going to self-assess how you have engaged in the material, the effort that you've put in, and the grade that you believe you should receive. So that's there'll be 3 points total per week. So for week 5, when you grade yourself on your reflection contribution, out of 3 points, maybe you get a 3, 2, 1, or whatever your what feels right for the grade that you would give yourself. So with that experiment, I'm curious to see how you engage with the materials and what you find meaningful in that material engagement. And I'm looking forward to hearing more of your mana'o and continuing this journey of uncovering educational foundations and the realities of American education and some of the underlying causes and effects and the beliefs that we approach American education. All right, we'll end it here. Thank you very much.